Hello and welcome to the show. Now, I don't know if you've seen the grim pictures from New York, but drone footage shows images of coffins being buried in a mass grave in the city as the death toll from the COVID-19 pandemic continues to rise in New York State. The location of the burial site is reported to be on Hart Island, and it's being used for people who apparently they've died of the virus in New York, but they have no next of kin or they couldn't afford a funeral. As of today, the 10th of April, New York State has more coronavirus cases than any other single country in the world. Nearly 160,000 people have contracted the virus. 7,000 have now died there. They are quite astonishing figures. But despite these horrific numbers, the US President Donald Trump has been enjoying a so-called coronavirus bump in the popularity stakes. Some people believed he's handled the crisis very badly, but others think he's doing a really good job. So what can we make of these conflicting views? Well, Larry Donnelly is an American from Boston who lives in Ireland. He lectures in law at NUI Galway. I had a Skype call with Larry during the week and I wanted to get his opinion about Donald Trump and his handling of the pandemic crisis. Here's that interview. Larry, a very good morning to you. Thanks very much for joining us. Maybe let's first of all look at how Donald Trump is handling the pandemic in the US. And secondly, maybe we could get your views on the perception of his handling of that crisis, good or bad. Tell me what you think.
Frankly, I think he's mishandled it. I think the mishandling began a while back. I think it began when he dismantled an office that was meant to deal with infectious diseases, when he let go a lot of people who were there who could have been working on this and put the United States in a much greater state of preparedness than it currently is. The reality is, because of his obfuscation in dealing with it at first, and because he didn't have the people in situ to deal with it, they've been playing catch up all the way. And that's really hindered a lot of the efforts to deal with this. And sadly, it's probably going to result in the needless deaths of very many Americans.
Yes, and this is the thing I wanted to ask you about, Larry. How can you explain the fact that he's enjoying a bump in popularity in the polls at the moment, despite those concerns that he's been handling the crisis badly? But of course, Trump is not the only leader who's enjoying a bump in the polls in terms of their popularity stakes. So too, for example, have leaders in the likes of France and of course in the UK, with Boris Johnson also gaining in the popularity stakes there. So how can you explain that at a time when New York State is really hit badly by the pandemic, that the US president can be enjoying such a bump in the popularity stakes?
Well, I think it's an ordinary instinct for people to want to rally around their political leaders in times of crisis. This is not unusual. Indeed, if we were to look back to 9/11, the events, the days after that, George W. Bush, who even back then had been quite a divisive figure, his poll numbers were around the 90% approval mark. So in that context, it's not surprising to see that Donald Trump has had a bump. But what's really notable is that the extent of the bump has been far more muted than, for instance, France and in Italy and elsewhere, where leaders have really jumped high in the polls. He's only received a marginal bounce. I mean, it's surprising given the kind of the chaos that we see emanating from there to see any bounce, but it is notable that it's not as sizable as elsewhere. And I think, Karen, that in many ways reflects the reality that the United States is very, very divided. There are roughly 40% of the American people for whom Donald Trump can do nothing right. There are around 40% of the people for whom Donald Trump can do nothing wrong. It is that smaller segment who neither love nor loathe the president. From a political point of view, they're the key group in American society, and it's how they think and how they perceive Donald Trump has handled the crisis that's going to be determinative here in terms of November. And if things do get bad, if we do get closer to that 250,000 fatality number, I have to think that his handling is going to rebound spectacularly against him with that key segment of society.
So let's look at his presumptive opponent in November. The Democratic candidate, Joe Biden, looks set to be the person who's going to be contesting against Trump in the presidential elections. But Biden isn't considered to be doing a particularly good job when it comes to the coronavirus at the moment, and coming up with strategies on how to deal with it.
No, and I mean it's down. It's really, this crisis has really brought back some of the weaknesses and fears about Joe Biden's candidacy within the Democratic Party. The reality is, in some of these addresses he's given from the basement of his home in Delaware, he's actually looked really badly. And he's fumbled over words and he's misreading sentences, even though he has his notes out in front of him. So he seems to lose the train of his thought. There were a lot of Democrats behind closed doors during the primary who wondered if this guy, who has shown visible signs of aging, who wondered if this guy was going to be able to do battle with Donald Trump, who, despite being just a few years younger, really just seems to have boundless energy, whether you like him or whether you loathe him. And that led to the flirtation with Mike Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York City. He ultimately performed very badly in the debate, and the flirtation was short-lived, especially after Biden came back so strongly in South Carolina and elsewhere. But there's no question but that Joe Biden is not a very strong political candidate. His chances are going to depend on, I think, in large part, the extent to which the American people decide that they can't take any more of Donald Trump, that they need to go a different direction, and they look at Biden as a safe pair of hands. Nothing spectacular, nothing earth-shattering, but just somebody who's a safer, better pair of hands than Donald Trump. Joe Biden hasn't done that argument much justice since the outbreak of the coronavirus. And I think a lot of those doubts among, again, that key segment of people who are going to decide this thing in November, I think a lot of those doubts are alive and well.
And I think there might be some hope in certain quarters in the US that the New York governor, Andrew Cuomo, may actually end up being parachuted in to take over from Joe Biden and to actually be the Democratic contender for the presidential elections. He's been seen to have been doing quite a good job in New York in handling the crisis. He's outspoken, he's taken action, and I think some of his fans may be hopeful that he might actually be parachuted in the end. Do you think that's just wishful thinking on the part of his fans, or is it actually a viable option?
I think it's highly unlikely. I think unless Joe Biden's health were to take a major turn for the worse, and I think, to be frank, Karen, we have to look at this realistically. Both Donald Trump and Joe Biden are in that high-risk category for acquiring COVID-19, so I don't think we can write anything in or out at present. That having been said, I still think it's a remote possibility. The reality is Joe Biden has won the vast majority of delegates. He is going to have the highest tally of delegates, however they decide this. And again, primary voting has been delayed and put off in this talk of a virtual convention. So things are going to be unorthodox. But I think it would be difficult for the party to undo the Democratic will as expressed by the primary electorate, barring something unforeseen. The other thing I'd say is, with respect to Andrew Cuomo, yes, he has really raised his profile, and I think he's dealt effectively with coronavirus in the state of New York, despite everything that's they're up against there. However, Andrew Cuomo has how shall I say it, an interesting past, and I think that he has an awful lot of negatives in terms of his own candidacy, which to some extent ruled him out, or made him not even a prospect for running for president. So he's had a good couple of weeks, but there's a long record there, and I'm not so sure how well he would play ultimately with the broader electorate.
Tell us a little bit more about some of those concerns about Andrew Cuomo.
Well, I mean, he would have a reputation at a personal level for bullying. There have been a number of incidents that in the past that people have cited. He went through a pretty painful divorce. Now, again, these are things that Donald Trump has had to deal with, and Donald Trump, I suppose, is guilty of at one level in spades. But the key point here is that Donald Trump plays the game by very different rules than everybody else does. So Cuomo will have some negatives personally. There's also the reality that he's a New Yorker, an ethnic New Yorker. How well does that play in key electoral college states? It's an open question. So I think that if some Democrats are looking at Cuomo as the answer to their prayers in the event that Biden isn't able to run against Donald Trump, which, again, to repeat, is a remote possibility, I think that their hopes might be misplaced if Andrew Cuomo is the guy they're really putting a lot of faith in.
And just looking at the pandemic, Larry, and those numbers of COVID cases in the US that I referred to earlier, what are your own views and those you're speaking with in the US about whether or not it's now reaching its peak and whether we're seeing the worst of the crisis in the States, or whether in fact it's going to sweep across most of the US?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's one that's hard to answer without a public health background. But what I'm hearing really is that people are doing to the extent they can. They are trying to follow the guidelines that are out there. People are understandably nervous. I mean, I talk to family and friends in Boston every day. They're understandably nervous about what's going on. If I was to pick an overarching sentiment, it is that they think that this will be under control. They think that this will go down. The rates of contagion, the rates of the passing on the infection will go down as the warm weather comes. Now, we don't know that for sure, but a lot of the doctors are saying that that's a possibility. What the consequent fear is then is that when things start to cool down towards later in the summer, and people get lax about the regulations and rules and stop social distancing, etc., that this thing could bound back. I think that's the real fear that I'm hearing from people over there. But of course, it's anybody's guess. Nobody really knows, and it's that climate of uncertainty that I think in many ways makes this disease so terrifying.
And what about just looking at the US economy? We know that the US has come up with some recent measures to pump trillions into the US economy. Is there a sense that even though lots and lots of businesses have been affected and millions of people have been made unemployed as a result of the COVID-19 crisis in the US, is there a sense that the US economy can bounce back, and maybe bounce back faster than other economies, like, for example, those in Europe and the Irish economy?
Yeah, I mean that's the huge fear. I mean, I know, for instance, talking to people in Boston, especially small business owners, who say that no matter what they get, that they think they're going to have a very tough time reopening their doors. A lot of, for instance, to put it in one way, for instance, individual pubs and restaurants. Where there's one owner and they have one operation and a small number of employees, can they afford to reopen? And if they can't, will it be large chains that take their place when they come back? So I think the impact on small business owners in particular is going to be something to watch. What I think we're all hoping for, and what I think one of the key things here is those of us who can, I think when this ends, I think it's really important for us to get out and support businesses, to support local businesses, to go out and spend some money. Those of us who can, because we really are all in this together. And the only way these places are going to survive is, though, if we patronized them before, we go back and patronize them again, because so much is riding on it. But at the end of the day, Karen, there's no question but that this is going to have a devastating economic impact on us all, and that we're all, to one way or another, going to wind up paying for this in the longer term. And again, it's just like so much that's resulted from this uncertain enemy. It's how long it's going to take, what the ultimate toll is going to be, and how fast we can bounce back from it.
And that's a good piece of advice to leave us with, Larry, to go out and support our own businesses when hopefully they can open their doors again very soon. But Larry Donnelly, thank you very much.